The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when Beatrice Sullivan saw the first crack appear in the cabin wall, water seeping through like blood from a wound. She pressed her hand against the rough timber, feeling the pressure of the flood building outside, and knew with absolute certainty that she was going to die here in this God-forsaken place her husband had dragged her to before consumption took him 6 months ago. The cabin sat in a low valley outside Eagle Pass, Texas, and she had stayed because she had nowhere else to go, no family back east who wanted a widow with nothing to her name. Now that decision seemed like the worst mistake of her 22 years. The water was already ankle-deep inside, rising faster than she could bail it out with her cooking pot. Through the single window, she could see the creek that normally ran gentle and clear had transformed into a raging brown torrent, debris tumbling past in the current. The rain hammered on the roof with such violence she thought it might cave in at any moment. Beatrice grabbed her canvas bag and started shoving things inside with shaking hands. A change of clothes, the photograph of her mother, the Bible her grandmother had given her. She was reaching for her husband's pocket watch when the entire front wall groaned and buckled inward. Water exploded through the gap with tremendous force, knocking her off her feet. The bag flew from her hands as she went under, the shock of the cold stealing her breath. She surfaced gasping, her heavy skirts dragging her down like anchors. The current spun her around and she slammed into the table, pain flaring in her ribs. Everything was chaos and roaring water and the terrifying creak of timber about to give way completely. She grabbed onto the table leg and pulled herself up enough to breathe, coughing and sputtering. The water was waist-deep now and rising fast. If she stayed inside, she would drown, but outside that current would sweep her away just as surely. There was no good choice, only different ways to die. The window. If she could get through the window, she might be able to climb onto the roof, by herself, a few more minutes at least. Beatrice let go of the table and fought through the water, every step a battle against the current trying to sweep her feet out from under her. Her fingers found the window frame and she hauled herself up, pushing at the glass. It would not budge. Swollen shut from the rain or maybe nailed closed, she could not remember. She was trying to break it with her elbow when she heard the sound of hooves outside, cutting through the roar of the storm. Then a voice, deep and urgent. "Is someone in there?" "Help," Beatrice screamed. "Please help me." She saw him through the warped glass, a man on horseback, hat pulled low against the rain. He dismounted in one fluid motion and waded toward the cabin, water up to his thighs. He was tall and broad-shouldered, and even through her panic Beatrice registered the strength in the way he moved. "Stand back from the window," he shouted. She pressed herself against the wall and watched as he smashed the glass with the butt of his pistol, clearing away the jagged edges. Water was pouring in through the broken front wall now with even more force, and the whole structure was starting to tilt. "Give me your hand," the man commanded, reaching through the window. Beatrice grabbed his arm and he pulled her through with such power that she practically flew out, glass fragments catching at her dress. Her feet found purchase in the mud for just a moment before the current swept them out from under her. She would have gone under if not for the iron grip on her wrist. "I have got you," he said, wrapping his arm around her waist and hauling her against his chest. "Hold on to me." She locked her arms around his neck as he carried her toward his horse, a big bay gelding that was shifting nervously in the rising water. Behind them came a tremendous crack as the cabin collapsed entirely, the walls folding inward and disappearing beneath the flood. The cowboy lifted her onto his horse with the same ease he might lift a child, then swung up behind her. His arm came around her waist again, solid and sure, and she felt his chest against her back as he urged the horse forward. "We have to get to higher ground," he said, his voice close to her ear. "Hold on tight." The horse lunged through the water, powerful muscles bunching beneath them. Beatrice clung to the saddle horn with white-knuckled hands, rain pelting her face as they fought their way out of the valley. The cowboy guided the gelding with practiced skill, finding the safest path through terrain that had become a maze of rushing water and treacherous mud. She did not know how long they rode. Time seemed to stretch and compress strangely, marked only by the rhythm of the horse's gait and the steady strength of the arm holding her in place. The cold was seeping into her bones, her wet clothes plastered to her skin, and she started to shake uncontrollably. "Not much farther," the cowboy said, and she heard something gentle in his voice beneath the urgency. "Stay with me now." They climbed onto higher ground where mesquite and scrub oak clung to rocky soil. In the distance, Beatrice could see the lights of Eagle Pass, but they turned away from town, heading toward a stand of cottonwoods where a small ranch house sat solid and dry. Smoke rose from the chimney, the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. The cowboy dismounted and pulled her down after him, catching her when her legs nearly buckled. Without a word, he scooped her into his arms and carried her toward the house. She was too cold and exhausted to protest, her head falling against his shoulder. He kicked the door open and brought her inside where warmth hit her like a physical thing. There was a fire burning in the hearth and oil lamps casting golden light across rough wooden walls and simple furniture. He carried her straight to the fire and set her on her feet, steadying her with his hands on her shoulders. "We need to get you out of those wet clothes," he said, then seemed to realize how that sounded. "I mean, you need dry things or you will catch your death. I will find something." Beatrice looked up at him properly for the first time. He was perhaps 28 or 30, with dark hair plastered to his head from the rain and eyes the color of creek water in summer. His face was all hard angles and weathered tan, the face of a man who spent his life outdoors. A scar cut through his left eyebrow, giving him a roguish look despite the concern in his expression. He disappeared into another room and returned with a pile of clothing. "These belong to my brother. He is back east now, but I think they will fit you better than anything of mine." He held out a shirt and trousers, then grabbed a blanket from the back of a chair. "I will turn around. You change and wrap up in this." True to his word, he turned his back and busied himself at the stove. Beatrice's fingers were so numb she could barely work the buttons on her dress, but she managed to peel off the sodden layers and pull on the dry clothes. They were far too large, the shirt hanging past her hips and the trouser legs pooling around her feet, but they were warm and soft from wear. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. "All right," she said, her voice coming out small and shaky. He turned around and studied her with those calm green eyes. "Sit by the fire. I am making coffee." She sank into the chair nearest the hearth and held her hands out to the flames, trying to stop shaking. Now that the immediate danger had passed, the full weight of what had happened was settling over her. Everything she owned was gone. The cabin, the few pieces of furniture, her clothes, the photograph of her mother. All of it swept away by the flood. The cowboy returned with 2 tin cups of coffee and pressed one into her hands. "Drink this. It will help with the chill." The coffee was strong and hot and bitter, and she had never tasted anything better. She wrapped both hands around the cup and let the warmth seep into her palms. "Thank you," she managed. "You saved my life." He shook his head. "I happened to be riding past and heard the cabin going down. Anyone would have done the same. I do not think most people would have ridden into a flood to pull a stranger through a window." A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Well, maybe not most people." She took another sip of coffee, studying him over the rim of the cup. He had changed his own wet clothes and now wore dark trousers and a simple cotton shirt, his damp hair pushed back from his face. He was handsome in a rough-hewn way, with the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly what he was capable of. "I am Beatrice Sullivan," she said. "Though I suppose you deserve to know the name of the woman you fished out of a flooded cabin." "Warren Foster," he replied, "and you do not owe me anything. I am just glad I was there in time." He paused, then added carefully, "That cabin you were living there alone." She nodded. "My husband passed 6 months ago, consumption. I stayed because I had nowhere else to go." The words came out flat, emotionless. She had cried all her tears for Thomas months ago. Warren's expression softened with understanding. "I am sorry for your loss. Thank you." She looked down at her coffee. "I suppose I truly have nothing now. Everything I owned was in that cabin." "You have your life," Warren said quietly. "That is worth more than any possession." He was right, of course, but that knowledge did not solve the practical problem of what she was going to do next. She had no money, no home, no prospects. The few people she had known in Eagle Pass were casual acquaintances at best. She was utterly alone in the world. As if reading her thoughts, Warren said, "You will stay here tonight. The storm should break by morning and then we can figure out what comes next. You need rest. I cannot impose on you like that. You are not imposing, I am offering." His tone left no room for argument. "You have been through an ordeal and you need somewhere safe to recover. I have got a spare room you can use." Beatrice wanted to protest further, but exhaustion was pulling at her like a physical weight. The warmth of the fire and the dry clothes and the coffee were all combining to make her realize just how tired she was. "Just for tonight," she said. "Then I will find somewhere else to go." "We will see," Warren said, in a way that suggested he was not about to let her worry about that right now. "Are you hungry? I have got stew." She had not eaten since that morning and suddenly realized she was famished. "Yes, please." He ladled stew into bowls and they ate in comfortable silence. The food was simple but good, rich with beef and vegetables. Beatrice tried to eat slowly, but she was so hungry she nearly finished before remembering her manners. Warren seemed amused rather than offended. "Have more if you want it. I made plenty." "This is fine, thank you." She set her bowl aside. "You live here alone, just me and the horses now." "Like I said, my brother went back east a few years ago and my parents passed before that. I run cattle on about 300 acres, enough to keep me busy." He looked around the simple room. "It is not much, but it is home." "It is wonderful," Beatrice said, and meant it. After months in that drafty, leaking cabin, this solid house with its warm fire felt like a palace. "You have built a good life here." Something flickered across his face, there and gone too quick to read. "I am working on it." The rain continued to hammer on the roof, but inside it felt safe and sheltered. Beatrice found herself relaxing for the first time and she could not remember how long. There was something deeply steady about Warren Foster, something that made her feel protected without being patronized. "You must be exhausted," Warren said after a while. "Let me show you where you can sleep." He led her down a short hallway to a small bedroom with a narrow bed covered in a patchwork quilt. There was a chest of drawers and a washstand with a pitcher and basin. Simple but clean. "I know it is not fancy," Warren said, "but the bed is comfortable and you should not be disturbed." "It is perfect," Beatrice said. "Truly, I cannot thank you enough for your kindness." Warren shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Get some rest. We can talk more in the morning." After he left, Beatrice sat on the edge of the bed and let out a long breath. Her whole body ached from being battered by the water and her ribs were tender where she had hit the table. But she was alive. Against all odds, she was alive. She lay back on the bed and pulled the quilt up to her chin. Outside, The storm raged on, but here in Warren Foster's spare room she felt safer than she had in months. Her last thought before exhaustion dragged her under was of strong arms lifting her onto a horse, of a voice saying, "I have got you," with absolute conviction. She slept deeply and dreamlessly, the sleep of the utterly spent. When Beatrice woke, morning light was streaming through the window and the sound of rain had stopped. For a moment she was disoriented, not recognizing where she was, and then memory flooded back. The cabin, the water, Warren Foster pulling her through the window. She sat up slowly, cataloging the various aches in her body. Her ribs protested when she moved, but nothing felt broken. Her muscles were sore from fighting the current. All things considered, she had gotten off remarkably easy. Someone had left a dress draped over the chair by the door. She got up to examine it and found it was simple but well made, dark blue cotton with a modest neckline. A piece of paper was tucked into the folds. "This belonged to my mother. I think it might fit. W.F." Beatrice held the dress up and felt an unexpected lump form in her throat. It was a thoughtful gesture, giving her something more appropriate to wear than his brother's oversized trousers. She washed her face in the basin and changed into the dress. It was a bit loose in the bodice, but otherwise fit reasonably well. Warren's mother must have been a similar build. She found Warren in the kitchen, cooking bacon and eggs on the stove. He looked up when she entered and his eyes widened slightly. "That was my mother's," he said. "It looks better on you than it ever did sitting in that trunk. Are you sure you want me to have it?" "I do not want to take something precious, I am sure. She would have wanted it to be worn by someone who needed it." He turned back to the stove. "How are you feeling?" "Sore but alive. Better than I have any right to be. Sit down. Breakfast is almost ready." Beatrice sat at the rough wooden table and watched him work. He moved with easy efficiency, clearly comfortable in the kitchen. When he set a plate in front of her, it was heaping with food. "You are trying to fatten me up," she said with a small smile. "You looked half-starved yesterday." When was the last time you had a proper meal? She could not remember. Money had been tight and she had been rationing her supplies, never sure when she would be able to afford more. "It has been a while," she admitted. "Well, eat up. You need your strength." They ate together, and Beatrice found herself stealing glances at him when he was not looking. In the daylight, she could see details she had missed the night before, the calluses on his hands from hard work, the sun lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead despite his attempts to push it back. "I rode out early to check the damage," Warren said after a while. "The creek is starting to recede, but it will be days before things are back to normal. Your cabin is completely gone. I am sorry." Beatrice nodded. She had known it would be, but hearing it confirmed still felt like a blow. "I understand. The road to town is washed out in places. It will take time to repair." He paused, then said carefully, "I know you said you would leave today, but I would like you to consider staying here a bit longer. At least until the roads are clear and you have had time to figure out your next move. I cannot keep imposing on your hospitality. It is not an imposition." He met her eyes directly. "I have plenty of space and I could use the company, truth be told. Gets lonely out here sometimes. You can help around the ranch if you want to feel useful, but mostly I just think you need a safe place to rest and recover. Let me provide that." Beatrice wanted to refuse on principle. She had been taking care of herself for months now, and pride demanded she continue to do so. But practicality warred with pride, and practicality won. She had nowhere to go and no means to get there. Warren was offering her a lifeline, and she would be a fool not to take it. "A few days," she said, "until I can find work in town and a place to stay." "However long you need," Warren replied, and something in his tone made her think he meant it. Over the following days, Beatrice settled into an unexpected routine at the Foster Ranch. She insisted on earning her keep, so Warren put her to work helping with the cooking and cleaning, tending the kitchen garden, gathering eggs from the chickens. She had grown up on a farm in Missouri, and the work was familiar, comforting in its simplicity. Warren spent his days working with the cattle and horses, riding out early and returning at midday for lunch before heading back out again. In the evenings, they ate dinner together and talked. He told her about growing up in Texas, about learning to ranch from his father, about the challenges of making a living off the land. She told him about her childhood in Missouri, her marriage to Thomas, and the move to Texas, the hard months after his death. "He was a good man," Beatrice said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set. "But he was a dreamer. He thought he could make his fortune out here and give me a fine life. Instead, he got sick and left me with nothing but that cabin and a pile of debt I could never hope to pay off. You must have loved him to follow him out here." "I thought I did. I was 18 and he was handsome and full of grand plans. My parents had both passed and I had no siblings, so when Thomas asked me to marry him and come to Texas, it seemed like an adventure." She smiled sadly. "I learned quickly that adventure is just another word for hardship most of the time." Warren was quiet for a moment. "Do you regret it, coming here?" Beatrice considered the question seriously. "I regret that Thomas died before he could see his dreams through. I regret the suffering. But I do not regret leaving Missouri. There was nothing for me there anymore. And now, what will you do?" "I suppose I will find work in Eagle Pass, maybe as a seamstress or a cook, save up enough money to rent a room somewhere." Even as she said it, the prospect seemed bleak. Eagle Pass was a small town and work was scarce, especially for a woman alone. "You could stay here," Warren said quietly. Beatrice looked at him in surprise. "I cannot stay indefinitely. People would talk. People always talk. But if it bothers you, we could make it official." He turned to face her fully. "I need help running this place and you need somewhere to live. We could come to an arrangement that benefits us both." "What kind of arrangement?" Beatrice asked, though she thought she knew. "Marriage," Warren said plainly. "A practical arrangement between two people who could help each other. You would have a home and security. I would have help with the ranch and someone to share the burden with. We could be partners." It was not a romantic proposal by any stretch, but Beatrice found herself considering it seriously. She barely knew Warren Foster, but what she did know she liked. He was kind and hardworking and honest. He had saved her life and asked nothing in return. There were far worse foundations for a marriage. "You do not love me," she said. "And I do not love you." "No," Warren agreed. "But we could build something good together anyway. I have seen marriages based on wild passion burn out and leave nothing but ashes. Maybe starting with respect and friendship is not such a bad thing. You deserve more than a marriage of convenience. Maybe. But I am 30 years old and I have not found it yet. At a certain point, you have to be practical about these things." He smiled slightly. "Besides, I like you. You are strong and smart and you do not complain about hard work. That is more than a lot of people can say." Beatrice laughed despite herself. "That is quite the romantic declaration. I know I am not much of a poet, but I mean what I say. Think about it at least. You do not have to decide right now." That night, lying in bed, Beatrice turned Warren's proposal over in her mind from every angle. It made sense on paper. She needed security and he needed help. They got along well and there was definitely an attraction there, even if neither of them had acted on it. But was that enough to build a marriage on? Her marriage to Thomas had started with love, or what she had thought was love at 18. And where had that gotten her? Widowed at 22 with nothing to her name. Maybe Warren was right. Maybe starting with mutual respect and letting the rest develop over time was not such a bad approach. 3 days later, as they were washing dishes after dinner, Beatrice said, "I have thought about your proposal." Warren's hands stilled in the dishwater. "And, I think you are right, we could build something good together." She took a breath. "So yes, I will marry you." He turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. "You are sure? I do not want you to feel pressured, I am sure. It makes sense for both of us, and I think we could be happy in time." A slow smile spread across Warren's face, transforming it. "Then I guess we have some planning to do." They were married 2 weeks later in Eagle Pass by the Justice of the Peace, with the blacksmith and his wife as witnesses. Beatrice wore the blue dress Warren had given her and carried a simple bouquet of wildflowers he had picked that morning. It was nothing like her first wedding, which had been a grand affair at the church in her hometown, but somehow this felt more real, more grounded in honesty about what marriage actually required. Warren slipped a plain gold band on her finger and kissed her gently when the justice pronounced them married. It was their first kiss, and it sent an unexpected thrill through Beatrice. There was more than just practical partnership here, she realized. There was genuine attraction and the promise of something deeper. They had a quiet dinner at the hotel in town to celebrate, then rode back to the ranch as husband and wife. It was strange and terrifying and exciting all at once. That night, Warren knocked on her bedroom door and she let him in, her heart pounding. They were both nervous, circling around the elephant in the room until finally Warren said, "We do not have to do anything you are not ready for. We can take this as slow as you need." Beatrice appreciated that more than she could say. "I want to," she said quietly. "I am just nervous." "So am I," Warren admitted with a small laugh. "It has been a while for me." The honesty disarmed her completely. She reached out and took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "Then I guess we figure it out together." What followed was tender and sweet, both of them learning each other with gentle touches and whispered words. It was so different from her experience with Thomas, who had been fumbling and over-eager. Warren was patient and attentive, making sure she was comfortable every step of the way. When it was over, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, and Beatrice felt something shift in her chest. This was more than convenience. This was the beginning of something real. The seasons changed, and Beatrice settled into her new life as Warren's wife. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, the cycle of planting and harvesting, calving and branding. She learned how to ride properly so she could help move the cattle. She learned to read the sky for signs of weather, to tell when a storm was coming or when the drought would break. Warren was true to his word about being a partner. He valued her opinions and listened when she made suggestions about improving things around the ranch. When she proposed expanding the garden and selling vegetables in town, he helped her build raised beds and find the best seeds. When she suggested bringing in some laying hens to sell eggs, he built her a proper chicken coop and ran. They worked side by side through the hot Texas summer, and slowly Beatrice realized she was falling in love with her husband. It happened in small moments. The way he always saved the best cut of meat for her at dinner. How he would come up behind her while she was cooking and wrap his arms around her waist, pressing a kiss to her temple. The proud look in his eyes when she successfully broke a young horse to saddle. The way he held her at night, solid and warm, like he never wanted to let go. She did not know when Warren started loving her back, but she saw it in the way he looked at her across the dinner table, in the gentle teasing that passed between them, in the passion that grew deeper every time they came together in their bed. Their marriage of convenience had transformed into something neither of them had planned for but both of them treasured. One evening in late October, nearly 6 months after their wedding, they sat on the porch watching the stars come out. Beatrice was knitting a sweater and Warren was working on repairing a bridle. It was a comfortable domestic scene, the kind of ordinary happiness she had never thought she would have. "I have something to tell you," Beatrice said, setting down her knitting. Warren looked up, instantly alert to the nervousness in her voice. "What is it?" "I am with child. I am fairly certain now." For a moment, Warren just stared at her. Then he set aside the bridle and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. "A baby," he said, wonder in his voice. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Beatrice asked, though she could feel the answer in the way he was trembling slightly. "Happy does not even begin to cover it." He pulled back to look at her, his eyes bright. "You have given me so much, Beatrice. A partnership, a real marriage, and now this. I do not know what I did to deserve you. You pulled me through a window," she said with a laugh that was half a sob. "You saved my life and then you gave me a new one worth living." "I think you did the same for me," Warren said quietly. "I did not realize how lonely I was until you were here, how empty this place felt without someone to share it with." They held each other as the stars wheeled overhead, planning for the future they were building together. A child. A family. It was more than Beatrice had ever hoped for when she had been standing in that flooding cabin, certain she was about to die. The pregnancy was difficult at times, especially in the Texas heat, but Warren was attentive and caring. He took over her heavier chores and fussed over her like a mother hen, which she found both annoying and endearing. He rode into town regularly to consult with the doctor, and came back with tonics and advice. In the spring, when the bluebonnets were painting the hills purple and the air was sweet with new growth, Beatrice went into labor. Warren sent for the midwife from town and paced the porch like a caged animal while she worked. It was a long labor, hours of grinding pain that left Beatrice exhausted, but finally, just as dawn was breaking, she heard the sharp cry of a newborn baby. The midwife cleaned up the infant and placed him in Beatrice's arms. A son. A perfect, healthy son with a shock of dark hair and his father's green eyes. Warren came in and stood by the bed, looking down at his wife and child with an expression of such pure love it made Beatrice's heart ache. "He is beautiful," Warren whispered, reaching out to touch the baby's tiny hand. Small fingers wrapped around his thumb and held on. "What should we call him?" Beatrice asked. They had discussed names but had not made a final decision. Warren thought for a moment, then said, "William, after my father, William Thomas Foster." Using her first husband's name as their son's middle name was a generous gesture, acknowledging the path that had led Beatrice here without jealousy or resentment. She loved Warren even more for it. "William Thomas Foster," she repeated. "It is perfect." The baby changed everything and nothing. The ranch still required constant work, but now it was punctuated by feedings and diaper changes, and the sweet weight of an infant sleeping on her shoulder. Warren was a devoted father from the first moment, taking William on slow rides around the property in his arms, singing to him in the evenings, getting up in the night to walk with him when he was fussy. Beatrice watched her husband transform from a solitary cowboy into a family man and fell more in love with him every day. This was what happiness looked like, she realized. Not grand gestures or passionate declarations, but the steady accumulation of small moments. Coffee in the morning. Working side by side. The way Warren looked at her over their son's head. The warmth of his hand finding hers in the dark. 2 years after William was born, a daughter arrived, screaming her way into the world with impressive volume. They named her Margaret Rose, and she had her mother's blonde hair and stubborn determination. Warren doted on her shamelessly, carrying her everywhere and letting her wrap him completely around her tiny finger. The ranch prospered as the years passed. Warren's hard work and Beatrice's business sense made a formidable combination. They expanded their herd and bought adjacent land when it became available. They built a proper barn and renovated the house, adding rooms for the growing family. Beatrice's garden and egg business brought in steady income, and she started selling preserves and baked goods in town as well. Eagle Pass grew from a small frontier town into a proper community, with a real school and a church and several shops along Main Street. William started school when he was 6, riding into town with his father every morning and coming home full of stories about his lessons and his friends. Margaret followed 2 years later, though she was less interested in books than in helping her mother with the animals. On quiet evenings when the children were in bed and the ranch was peaceful, Warren and Beatrice would sit on the porch together. Sometimes they talked and sometimes they just sat in comfortable silence, but always Warren held her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "Do you ever think about that day I pulled you out of the cabin?" Warren asked one evening when they had been married nearly 8 years. "All the time," Beatrice admitted. "I think about how close I came to dying. How if you had ridden a different way or arrived 5 minutes later, I would be gone. I think about that too, how my whole life would be different if I had not decided to check on that valley. No wife, no children, just me alone in this house, still wondering what was missing." He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. "You changed everything for me, Beatrice. You know that. You changed everything for me too," she said. "You gave me hope when I had none, a home when I was homeless, love when I thought I would never feel it again." "I did not know what love was until you," Warren said quietly. "I thought I did, but I was wrong. Love is choosing the same person every day. It is building a life together one moment at a time. It is watching you with our children and feeling like my heart might burst. That is love." Beatrice leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, breathing in the familiar scent of leather and hay and sunshine. "I love you, Warren Foster, more than I ever thought it was possible to love someone. I love you too. From the moment I saw you through that window, soaked and scared but still fighting, I think some part of me knew you were going to change my life." They sat together as the sun set, painting the Texas sky in shades of gold and crimson, and Beatrice thought about the strange path that had led her here. The loss and grief and fear that had nearly drowned her, literally and figuratively. The man who had pulled her from the flood and given her a reason to keep going. The love they had built together, solid and enduring as the land itself. She had woken up in Warren's arms that terrible night, soaked and shivering and alive, and she had never left. She never would. This was home. This ranch, this man, these children, this life they had created together. It was everything she had never known she wanted, and she was grateful for it every single day. William came running out onto the porch, Margaret trailing behind him. "Papa, can you tell us about when you met Mama?" "The flood story," Warren laughed and pulled William onto his lap while Margaret climbed into Beatrice's. "Again, I have told you that story 100 times. But it is the best story," Margaret insisted. So Warren told it again, the tale that had become family legend. How he had been riding back to the ranch in the storm and heard the cabin collapsing. How he had pulled a brave, beautiful woman through a window and carried her to safety. How she had been wearing his brother's old clothes and looked like a half-drowned kitten, but was still the most remarkable person he had ever met. He left out some parts, the fear and desperation, the very real possibility of death. He made it an adventure story, exciting but safe, appropriate for young ears. But Beatrice remembered the truth of it, the terror and the cold and the certain knowledge that she was going to die. And she remembered strong arms around her, a voice saying, "I have got you," the feeling of being saved in every sense of the word. That night, after the children were asleep and she and Warren were lying in their bed together, she whispered into the darkness, "Thank you." "For what?" Warren asked, his voice drowsy. "For everything. For saving me, for loving me, for this life." Warren pulled her closer, tucking her head under his chin. "Thank you for staying, for building this with me, for making me happier than I ever thought I could be." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, and Beatrice's last thought was that she had finally found where she belonged. Not in Missouri, where she had been born, not in that terrible cabin where she had nearly died, but here in Warren Foster's arms, in this house they had made a home, on this land they worked together. She had been drowning and he had saved her. And in saving her, he had given her a life more beautiful than anything she could have imagined. A life of honest work and deep love and the kind of happiness that came from choosing each other every single day. The years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the growing children. William grew tall and strong like his father, taking on more responsibility around the ranch. He had Warren's quiet competence and Beatrice's head for figures, and she knew he would make an excellent rancher one day. Margaret was all fire and determination, insisting on learning everything her brother learned, refusing to be limited by her skirts. When William was 12 and Margaret was 10, Beatrice discovered she was pregnant again. It was a surprise, as they had assumed their family was complete, but a welcome one. This pregnancy was easier than the others, and when she went into labor on a cool November evening, Warren barely had time to send for the midwife before another son arrived. They named him James, and he was a happy, easy baby who seemed content to watch the world with wide, curious eyes. William and Margaret adored him, fighting over who got to hold him or help with his care. The ranch continued to thrive. They now had one of the larger operations in the county, with a solid reputation for quality cattle and fair dealing. Warren had taken on 2 hired hands to help with the work, young cowboys who lived in the bunkhouse he had built near the barn. The Foster Ranch was known as a good place to work, with decent pay and a boss who treated his men with respect. Beatrice had expanded her businesses as well. She now sold her goods at the general store in Eagle Pass and had regular customers who came from miles around for her preserves and baked goods. She had taught Margaret to bake and sew, skills every woman needed, though her daughter was just as interested in riding and roping. On Sundays, they went to church as a family, sitting in the pew Warren's parents had once occupied. They were respected members of the community, known for their hard work and fair dealing. People still remembered the story of how they met, how Warren had pulled Beatrice from a flooded cabin, and it had taken on an almost mythical quality in the retelling. Beatrice sometimes thought about her first husband Thomas, who was buried in the cemetery on the edge of town. She visited his grave occasionally, bringing flowers and saying a prayer. She had loved him in her way, but what she had with Warren was something entirely different, deeper, stronger, built on a foundation of partnership and mutual respect that had blossomed into the kind of love poets wrote about. When Beatrice was 35 and Warren was 43, they celebrated their 15th wedding anniversary. Warren surprised her by arranging for the hired hands to watch the ranch while they took a rare trip into San Antonio for a few days. They stayed at a nice hotel and ate at restaurants and walked around the city like young sweethearts. On their last evening, they were strolling along the river when Warren stopped and turned to face her. "I have something to tell you," he said, his tone serious enough to make her nervous. "What is it?" "I have been thinking a lot lately about our life together, about how far we have come from that day in the flood." He took both her hands in his. "I did not know how to say this back then, but I fell in love with you the moment I saw you through that window." You were terrified but still fighting, and I knew right then that you were someone special, someone I wanted in my life." Beatrice felt tears prick her eyes. "I did not know that. I did not think you would believe me if I said it. It sounded too much like something from a dime novel." Love at first sight in the middle of a disaster. He smiled. "But it was true. And every day since then I have loved you more, watching you become a mother, a businesswoman, the heart of our home. You are the most remarkable person I have ever known, Beatrice Foster, and I thank God every day that I was riding past that cabin when I was." "Warren," she whispered, overwhelmed by the depth of emotion in his words. "I asked you to marry me for practical reasons," he continued. "Because it made sense, because we could help each other. But the truth is, I was already half in love with you and looking for any excuse to keep you in my life. Marrying you was the smartest thing I ever did, but not for the reasons I said. It was smart because you are my perfect match. My partner in every way, the love of my life." Beatrice threw her arms around him, not caring that they were standing in the middle of the walkway. "I love you so much. You gave me everything. A home, a family, a purpose. You made me believe in happiness again when I thought that part of my life was over." They held each other as the evening settled around them, and Beatrice thought about the journey they had taken together. From strangers to spouses to partners to lovers. From a practical arrangement to a love story that would last a lifetime. When they returned to the ranch, life resumed its familiar patterns. William was now 16 and taking on more adult responsibilities, working alongside his father from dawn to dusk. He had started courting the banker's daughter, a sweet girl named Sarah whom Beatrice approved of wholeheartedly. Margaret was 14 and still resisting the idea that she should be thinking about marriage and domesticity, more interested in training horses than catching a husband. James was 5, a bright and curious boy who followed his siblings everywhere, asking endless questions about everything. He had a particular fascination with the natural world, collecting rocks and insects and studying them with intense concentration. The ranch had become everything Warren and Beatrice had dreamed it could be. They had built not just a successful business but a legacy for their children. The house had been expanded again and was now large and comfortable, filled with the accumulated treasures of a life well lived. Family photographs on the walls, books on the shelves, the patchwork quilts Beatrice made during the winter months, Warren's saddles and tack, beautifully maintained and perfectly functional. When Beatrice turned 40, Warren threw her a party and invited the whole community. It seemed like half of Eagle Pass turned out, filling their house and yard with laughter and music. There was a huge meal, dancing, and speeches about what a pillar of the community Beatrice had become. She stood on the porch looking out at the gathering and felt overwhelming gratitude. 20 years ago, she had been drowning in a flooded cabin with nothing and no one. Now she was surrounded by family and friends, celebrated and loved. The transformation was almost too much to comprehend. Warren came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" "How lucky I am," Beatrice said simply. "How different my life could have been if you had not come along." "I am the lucky one," Warren replied. "You turned this house into a home. You gave me children and partnership and love. Everything good in my life comes from you." "We built it together," Beatrice corrected. "That is what makes it special. We chose each other and we chose to make this work, and look what we created." She gestured at the scene before them. William dancing with Sarah, clearly smitten. Margaret showing some of the younger children how to rope a fence post. James running around with his friends, laughing. The hired hands enjoying the food and company. Neighbors who had become like family over the years. "This is what happiness looks like," Warren said. Not one perfect moment, but a whole life of moments strung together. Every morning waking up next to you. Every evening watching the sunset from this porch. Every challenge we faced and overcame together. Every time one of the children made us laugh or drove us crazy, Beatrice added with a smile. Every crop we harvested, every calf born, every small victory and occasional defeat, it all adds up to a life worth living. More than worth living, Warren said. A life worth celebrating. As the sun set on her 40th birthday, Beatrice reflected on the truth of his words. She had survived the flood that day so long ago, but more than that, she had gone on to thrive. She had built a family and a business and a place in the community. She had loved and been loved in return, deeply and truly. The seasons continued their eternal cycle, and the foster family continued to grow and change. William married Sarah when he was 20, and they built a house on the eastern edge of the ranch property. A year later, they made Warren and Beatrice grandparents with the birth of a baby girl they named Emma. Holding her granddaughter for the first time, Beatrice was struck by the weight of history. This tiny person was connected to her through blood and love, part of the legacy she and Warren had built. Emma would grow up on this ranch just as her father had, learning the same lessons about hard work and honesty, and the value of land well tended. Margaret finally married at 22, choosing a cowboy who worked on a neighboring ranch. He was a good man who appreciated her independent spirit and did not try to tame it. They settled on a small spread to the south, and Margaret continued to train horses, developing a reputation as one of the best in the region. James surprised everyone by developing an interest in law. After finishing school in Eagle Pass, he went to Austin to study, returning home during the summers to help on the ranch. Warren was disappointed at first that his youngest son did not want to be a rancher, but Beatrice reminded him that each child had to find their own path. "We raised them to think for themselves," she pointed out. "We cannot complain when they do exactly that." Warren eventually came around and admitted she was right. Having a lawyer in the family turned out to be useful anyway, as James helped them navigate increasingly complex contracts and land deals. The years passed, with the steady rhythm of ranch life. There were good years when the cattle were fat and the prices high, and lean years when drought or disease tested their resilience. But Warren and Beatrice faced it all together, their partnership only growing stronger with time. They added more grandchildren to the family as the years went on. William and Sarah had 3 children total. Margaret and her husband had 2. Even James eventually married and brought his wife back to Eagle Pass, setting up a law practice in town and adding twins to the growing foster clan. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the entire extended family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. There were 30 people around the table for dinner, 3 generations breaking bread together. Beatrice looked around at all these people who existed because she and Warren had found each other, and her heart was so full she could barely breathe. After dinner, Warren stood and raised his glass. 25 years ago, I married the woman I pulled from a flooded cabin. I told her we could build something good together, and she believed me. Everything you see here, everyone in this room exists because she said yes to a man she barely knew and trusted him to keep his word. He turned to Beatrice, his eyes suspiciously bright. You have given me the greatest gift anyone could give, a life filled with love and purpose, children and grandchildren to carry on after we are gone, partnership and friendship and passion. I loved you that first day even though I did not know it yet, and I will love you until my last breath. Thank you for waking up in my arms and never leaving. The room erupted in applause and cheers. Beatrice stood and embraced her husband, tears streaming down her face. Thank you for being there when I needed you most, she whispered into his ear. Thank you for saving me in every way a person can be saved. They danced that night, moving slowly to the fiddle music, surrounded by family and friends. Beatrice rested her head on Warren's shoulder and closed her eyes, savoring the moment. This was joy. This was peace. This was the life she had been given when she should have died. As they grew older, Warren and Beatrice gradually handed more responsibility to William and his family. The ranch would pass to him eventually. Everyone understood that, but they made sure Margaret and James received their fair share of the family legacy. Land for Margaret's horse training business. Funds for James's law practice. It was important to both of them that all their children were provided for. Warren's hair went silver and his movements slowed. Beatrice's hands developed arthritis that made the fine sewing she loved more difficult. But they were healthy and active, still managing to ride out to check the fences or sit on the porch in the evening. They talked often about their years together, reminiscing about the early days when it was just the two of them building something from nothing. About the children's childhoods, the funny stories and scary moments, about the way the ranch had grown and prospered, about the depth of love that had developed between them. You remember when I proposed? Warren asked one evening when they were both in their 60s. How unromantic it was. You told me we could build something good together, Beatrice said with a smile. And you were right. We built something better than good. We built something extraordinary. I should have told you I loved you then. I should have swept you off your feet with poetry and grand declarations. No, Beatrice said firmly. You gave me exactly what I needed. Honesty and partnership and the space to fall in love naturally. If you had overwhelmed me with passion right away, I might have run. I needed to learn to trust you first, to see who you really were. And then I fell in love with you so deeply, there was no going back. Warren took her hand, his thumb finding the familiar groove of her wedding ring. I cannot imagine my life without you. Even trying to picture it makes me feel lost. Then do not try, Beatrice said. We have years left together. And when our time comes, I hope it is like this. Sitting together, holding hands, surrounded by the life we built. That sounds perfect to me. They were blessed with many more years together. They saw all their grandchildren grow up and some of them marry and start families of their own. Great-grandchildren arrived, and the ranch house was often filled with the sound of young voices and running feet. Warren remained strong and vital well into his 70s, still riding out to check the cattle, though he left the heavy work to the younger generation. Beatrice kept her mind sharp by reading voraciously and teaching her grandchildren to cook and sew. They were pillars of the community, respected elders who had seen Eagle Pass transform from a rough frontier town into a proper city. On a warm spring day when Beatrice was 72 and Warren was 80, they took a ride out to the spot where her cabin had once stood. The creek ran gentle and clear, nothing like the raging torrent it had been that terrible day so many years ago. There was no trace of the cabin left, nature having reclaimed the site completely. They dismounted and stood by the water hand in hand. Right here, Warren said quietly. This is where I found you, where everything changed. I was so scared, Beatrice remembered. I thought I was going to die. And then I heard your voice outside and I knew I had a chance. Best decision I ever made, riding out to check this valley that day. If I had gone a different way, if I had waited until the storm passed. He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. But you did not, Beatrice said. You were there when I needed you, and you have been there every day since. She turned to face him fully. I have had a good life, Warren, better than I ever dreamed possible. And it is all because you pulled me through that window and gave me a second chance. We gave each other a second chance, Warren corrected. You saved me just as much as I saved you. I was lonely and lost, going through the motions of living without really understanding what life could be. You showed me. You made everything better just by being there." They stood by the creek for a long time, remembering and celebrating. The flood that could have ended Beatrice's life had instead been the beginning of something beautiful. From that moment of terror and desperation had grown a love story that spanned decades, a family that would continue for generations, a legacy of hard work and devotion. As they rode back to the ranch, moving slowly to accommodate their aging bodies, Beatrice looked at Warren's profile and felt the same surge of love she had felt when she first realized she was falling for him. It had not dimmed with time. If anything, it had grown stronger, deepened by years of choosing each other over and over again. That night, they lay in bed together as they had thousands of times before. Warren's arm was around her and her head rested on his shoulder. It was comfortable and familiar, home in human form. "I love you," Beatrice whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Warren replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Always have. Always will." They fell asleep like that, two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life that was everything either of them could have wanted. Two people who had proven that the best love stories are not the ones that start with fireworks and passion, but the ones that start with choice and partnership and grow into something unbreakable. The ranch continued to prosper under William's management, and the Foster family remained a central part of Eagle Pass. Warren and Beatrice lived to see their 70th wedding anniversary, a remarkable milestone that was celebrated by the entire town. They sat in chairs of honor at the celebration, accepting congratulations from friends and family, their great-grandchildren playing at their feet. When Warren passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 83, Beatrice mourned deeply, but found comfort in the knowledge that they had been blessed with so many years together. She lived another 5 years, staying active and involved with the ranch and her family until the very end. On a quiet evening in the fall, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, Beatrice closed her eyes for the last time. Her last thought was of strong arms lifting her onto a horse, of a voice saying, "I have got you," of waking up to green eyes and a slow smile. She had woken up in Warren Foster's arms and she had never left, and it had been the greatest adventure of her life. The Foster Ranch passed to the next generation, and the story of Warren and Beatrice became family legend. How a cowboy had pulled a drowning woman from a flooded cabin, and they had built a life together that lasted 50 years. How a practical marriage had become a great love story. How two people who should have been strangers instead became partners, lovers, and eventually legends. Their graves sit side by side in the Eagle Pass Cemetery, under a cottonwood tree with a view of the ranch they built together. The stone reads, Warren Foster, 1843–1926, and Beatrice Foster, 1844–1931, together forever. And every spring when the creek floods and the bluebonnets bloom, someone from the Foster family rides out to the place where the cabin once stood and leaves wildflowers by the water. A remembrance of the day a cowboy saved a woman's life, and in doing so, found his own. A celebration of the love that grew from that moment of crisis into something that would last generations. Because the best love stories are not the ones written in the stars, but the ones built by human hands. Day by day, choice by choice, moment by moment. Warren and Beatrice Foster understood that truth, and they lived it every single day of their lives together. The flood had taken everything from Beatrice, but it had also given her everything. In the rushing water and the collapsing cabin, in the strong arms and the steady voice, She had found not just rescue but redemption, a second chance at happiness, a partner who would walk beside her through all the joys and sorrows of life. A love that would endure long after they were both gone, living on in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried their blood and their legacy forward into the future. That was the real miracle of that day by the flooded creek. Not just that Warren saved Beatrice's life, but that they saved each other. Two lonely people who found each other in the middle of a disaster and decided to build something beautiful together. Two people who proved that sometimes the best marriages start with a practical proposal and grow into something that poets would envy. Their story lived on in Eagle Pass for generations, told and retold until it took on the quality of myth. But those who knew them, who saw them sitting together on their porch in the evening or working side by side in the garden, knew the truth was even better than the legend. They had been truly, deeply happy. They had built a life and a love that was everything either of them had ever wanted. And it all started with a flood, a cowboy, and a woman who woke up in his arms and never left.